Welcome to Module A-. This module relates to setting up what adaptations we are going to evaluate during the remaining parts of the workshop. There's two sides to this module. The first side, on the left-hand side, sets out the types of evaluations of adaptations that can be evaluated, while the right-hand side is where you will nominate the different adaptations that you would like to work with during the workshop. It's important to note that time can be a restriction. The tool is enabled to evaluate up to 40 adaptation options, though most groups are likely to evaluate between 3 and 7 options given the time they have during the workshop. Let's move over to the left-hand side where we can start to unpack what PAiCE is best at dealing with. PAiCE works best when the adaptations that are to be evaluated meet the following criteria. That the adaptation is a changed farmer practice. For instance, we don't really want to evaluate as part of this agronomy evaluation workshop things like irrigation works, dredging canals, or even early warning system development, because they're not an action that a farmer takes. So we want to focus in on adaptations that involve a farmer choosing to do a particular thing. The second element is that an adaptation directly relates to change in yield. The tool is essentially working on change in yield and change in economics of the existing system compared to the adaptation. So if the adaptation doesn't directly relate to changes in yield, even if it's indirect, it's very hard to capture within this tool. The third element is that the adaptation benefit can be measured on a per hectare basis. Now, this is important again because the tool is working on the limitations, the constraints within particular fields, the types of climate hazards that are likely to occur in those fields on a per hectare basis. So we want the adaptations, we want to be able to understand that on a per hectare basis. Finally, that the adaptation is not hypothetical. For instance, the development of a new maize line is hypothetical. We don't know how that will perform under different constraints and different climate scenarios. That's a hypothetical. So we want to do something that is not hypothetical, that is essentially we know how it will perform in different climate scenarios and under different production constraints. And the adaptation is actionable. So there's no point selecting something that really we won't be able to promote or to move forward with. The tool also works best when the adaptation has a clear definition to help with later validation. So things like better fertilizer, crop diversification, a new cultivar, fertilizer use, climate smart crop varieties. These are really vague and it doesn't help us to then later validate or discuss to a wider audience. So we want to be more specific. If it's about better fertilizer, is it about timing, type, rate? What is it about better fertilizer use that you want to go to? Likewise, PAiCE doesn't do well with enablers such as irrigation schemes, changing policies, or providing subsidies. And indeed, that doesn't meet the criteria that we've set out before around being a farmer practice, around being related to yield, around being measurable on a per hectare basis. So things like these, we want to be very specific, but we want it to meet the above criteria. So what we've done is we've set out the categories that are relevant to the tool. You can see in this top line here, and those categories are varietal change, changed planting activities, changed resource use, management systems, water use adjustment, crop diversification, and harvest and post-harvest adjustment. And within that, we then have subcategories that relate to those different categories. What's really important as you go through this workshop is to think about the top 10 priority needs in terms of production constraints and climate hazards. And those are set out in the bottom half of this submodule. So as a workshop, have a look at those and think, what can we do to address these constraints? What are our best options for addressing these top 20 adaptation needs? Of course, you've also got the notes section where you can write certain things were mentioned but weren't actioned, etc. When we move over to the right-hand side, we then have where we're listing out possible adaptation options. So this is a pre-filled example, but what you'll see is you'll choose from a category, and those categories again are the ones that we see over here. And then you'll get a drop-down menu that looks at the subcategory and then a name. And we want to keep that name as short as possible because that's the name that's going to transfer into our future modules. So if it's really long, it will just make the tool look very cluttered. So try and reduce the number of characters as far as you can, but then put in some definitions and notes over here. So it might be full residue retention, or it might be partial residue retention, and then you put the percentage over here. If you nominate, for instance, conservation agriculture, then you'd want to put the details of if you're doing all of the different elements or some, or how you're going to do that. So within this module, you can also select other, and that will allow you to give it a name and a definition as well. But if you're choosing other, really make sure, does it fit the criteria that has been discussed? Because we've tried to capture the real major agronomic adaptation options. So if you're choosing other, you have to think, does it fit that criteria or not? As always, when you're done, you can nominate not applicable, N-A, and that will close out. So essentially what we're doing here is shortlisting the different adaptation options. Just because you've listed it here does not necessarily mean that you will move forward with that in the following modules. So this is a longer list, and everything that you put in this list will not then need to be evaluated. It's simply a list of discussion points that have been there. So you might also want to put in your definition and notes that many people didn't think that it was relevant to the priority constraints, or it was too hypothetical to move forward with, or too difficult to measure on a per hectare basis, but it was added. And again, you've got your notes section at the bottom to discuss this. So this is module A-, where we're simply shortlisting, we're long listing the different adaptation options, and we're looking at the criteria that's needed for them to be long listed.